Prologue. Contact with Asset 019 lost. Last seen, Solar Recon into Markallan territory. Current theory? Killed while trying too hard. More than likely. Admiral Soles knew he should have pulled that asset sooner. Young Talbert's assertiveness had seen him quickly rise through the ranks of the enemy fleet, but the more Interstar rewarded him, the more eager he got. Some reports suggested he had begun to risk his cover. Now it appeared those efforts had gotten him killed. A waste of an asset, but perhaps it was just as well. At least that was one less thing to worry about. He had enough on his plate. 15 years of planning, building, and training for this moment were finally coming together. Soon, the Confederation of Polaris would be ready to rise from the false ashes of its assumed demise. Soles read the rest of the report one more time to reassure himself that things were indeed going well despite the one problem. There was more than the lost asset, but a quick skim suggested it was all trivial. Nothing worth the Grand Marshal's time. Unfortunately, Admiral Soles didn't seem to be worth his time either. Whenever he asked the aide for an update, she could only check her screen and confirm that the Grand Marshal was still in conference. That left the Admiral with nothing to do but stare at the grey walls of the outer office, empty save for a large banner with the Polaris insignia, a dark navy bear silhouette outlining the full constellation of Ursa Major with a bright star above the bear. To the side of that banner, a thin window allowed Admiral Soles to get a glimpse of the city far outside the base. He had to shake himself to keep his emotions from taking over. He only allowed a moment to rub his wedding band. She'd told him to always remember, and he always had. She had been among the volunteers, the brave men and women who gave their lives to protect those left behind. He hadn't been able to talk her out of it, but he could do his best to see that she and they would be able to rest in peace at last. Assuming he ever got the chance to actually move things along. The Grand Marshal had demanded an instant report, yet he'd spent the last half hour locked in the inner office arguing with Soles didn't even know who. Some man he only knew as Multi-Step. Being kept in the dark sent Soles past irritated, headed for pissed off. Half of him wanted to barge in, deliver the report, and then leave so he could get on with the operation. Yet he would have to bite his tongue now, just like always. Technically, the Grand Marshal could see him killed for sneezing if he wanted. He never abused that power, but he had the right, which was enough for most men with any trace of intelligence. The rest, if they were lucky, found themselves stuck at low ranks with the worst jobs on the docket. The Admiral had neither, so if he had to bite his tongue to keep his rank and position, he would. At last, the doors to the main office opened. The Grand Marshal stormed out, only to stop with a hand on his hip when he saw Admiral Soles. The Marshal wore a simple, clean black suit and a blood-red tie with black lines. Every hair on his head was straight and blond, no grey allowed, but the man did have a slight belly bulge. "This better be good news, Admiral," the Marshal said. So, it happened again. Admiral Soles knew better than to touch it. "It is, sir. Our agents report Operation Juno is progressing well. The Gold Group will be primed and ready for us." "Gold Group? We got that lucky?" "We did, sir." "Even better. Though we may want to send some help along. Major Harlem shouldn't be underestimated." "Covered, sir. I sent 2 of our best non-frigates with additional troops for the intercept." Admiral Soles always had to swallow that one. Once they came out, it would be hard to hide who all the non-ships really belonged to. The whole thing was a propaganda move, really. "Oh, we don't condone piracy." Bullshit. Soles started on those non-ships long before Polaris had to fake being destroyed by Markalla. Their activities were more than condoned. They were ordered. The Grand Marshal hummed with a devious smile. "Good. At least someone out there has some courtesy. Unlike a certain admiral I know." This time, Admiral Soles couldn't leave it. Whoever this other admiral was, he wasn't a member of their own forces. The Polaris leadership had made a point of making sure all their assets went through him. That meant this other admiral was an outsider. Forget pissed off. The idea of someone separated from Polaris being so intimately involved, and thus out of their control, sent Soles' stomach into a knot. "Who is this admiral, sir?" he asked without hesitation. "Why is he so important that you put up with him brushing you off like that?" The Grand Marshal's body bounced in silent laughter while he thumped his hand on the Admiral's shoulder. He's a means to an end, Admiral. Too bad he knows it as well as we do. Still, even he doesn't know our real plan. But who is he, sir? Someone within Interstar? Now the Marshal laughed loud enough to echo in the outer office. Hardly. Let's just say he's a non-human that has been directly involved with Gold One on more than one occasion, sometimes without them knowing it. Admiral Celeste went blank while his mind decoded the message. The reference to a non-human was an obvious clue. Didn't take long for him to whittle down the list to just one that would even consider taking part in their plan. After that, Admiral Celeste knew he wouldn't be sleeping well for a long time. "You can't be serious," he said, not trying to hide his shock. "With respect, how can you work with the very people who destroyed our original colonies, to say nothing of dealing with the man who led those attacks?" "As I said, he's a means to an end. He'll accomplish what no one has before, and we'll help him. Then he'll help us get Markala and the United Systems Republic right where we want them. And then he'll stab us in the back. Of course he will. He's a fanatic who believes some nonsense about Jantans being the supreme race in the galaxy. But that same belief will sow the seeds of his own demise. Assuming he doesn't kill us in the process." Admiral Celeste felt his military pride silence the comment, which he used to draw himself up in a show of confidence to his leader. Kill us? Ha! Not a chance. They were too well prepared now. Polaris would need to fake their destruction this time. They would be the aggressors. He would see Polaris make good on their promise to find justice for the fallen. For them, for her, and for the son who may yet see a nation safe at last, Admiral Celeste would not allow them to fail. The Admiral rubbed his wedding band again while the Grand Marshal checked an ancient pocket watch. "From one brick wall to another," the Grand Marshal said. "I'll be out of touch for a while, Admiral. I expect you to handle things from here on out." Admiral Celeste offered a soft salute. "Yes, sir. I won't let you down, sir." The Grand Marshal returned the salute, then headed for the outer doors. Admiral Celeste turned to catch him there. "If I may ask, sir, where will you be?" "In conference with our dear Command Council." "I thought President Marcus was on his war tour." "Wrong council, Admiral. I'm talking about the one that doesn't know what's going on." Admiral Celeste nodded with a devious smile all his own. Then he watched the most successful asset in Polaris history walk out the door. Part 1 of Admirals and Marshals. Chapter 1 Foolish Orders. Major Jason Harlem could almost feel the heat from the PMM-14, or PMAG, on his hip. Hours of shooting holograms had done little to cool his insides, so he found himself in the mess hall trying a cup of Earl Grey tea. It was as much a joke as a drink choice, but it still failed, much like his efforts with his superiors. He'd spent his time on long-range calls with Earth trying to convince them to send someone else. The lines had been silent for months, but that was more than enough time for the Jantans to gather a force for their next assault. Based on recent deep scans, that's exactly what they were doing, too. Sooner or later, this little outpost would be on the front lines of the latest Jantan war. Yet, Command seemed to be looking at recent events rather than their own intelligence. A few months of silence and suddenly Command thinks Markala has given up? Yeah, right. It's not like he relished combat. Jason had buried a lot of friends and group members over the years, but that was also what had his chest hotter than the tea he now drank. The only way to put an end to it was to remain vigilant and ready for the next offensive. Interstar needed to have the best on the front lines to ensure civilian and soldier alike lived to see tomorrow. His group had proven their ability to do just that more times than he could count, though not everyone had come back from those missions. So where was his highly decorated group being sent now? Back to the inner worlds to cover freighters traveling from one colony to another. A task so simple that a Corvette would be enough. Okay, too, but it's not like they got to shine on their own very often. Having his frontline groups had to do a job two such ships could handle in their sleep made the whole thing even more insulting. Worse than that, a civilian councilman, a suit, had written the orders. He didn't technically know that's what happened, but the signs were all there. Signs purposely dropped by his superior to express his own displeasure at the source. Suits couldn't give orders to the military officially, but General Carson had gotten his hands on the request, and it didn't take a genius to connect the dots. It had read, in part, Specific protection should be arranged for a high-value civilian convoy to ensure the safe and efficient delivery of necessary civilian materials and personnel for necessary civilian endeavors. In other words, a suit had some pet project, good or bad being irrelevant, that needed protection, and they wanted the military to make a show of protecting it as a symbol to the civilians, and so on. Didn't matter what was really needed, only that the flag be shown in strength. It was a waste. It was foolish. It was criminal, and it was beyond his control. He had his orders. He could only hope the lines would hold long enough for him to get there before the Jantons broke through and threatened any more colonies. Jason rubbed a heavy hand across his face. He gave a soft chuckle when he thought about the many who thought he was too thin to be a soldier. Even his mom, God rest her soul, used to joke about his face looking squished in on the sides. Some said his dark brown hair and eyes, along with smooth features, helped balance that a bit. All they cared was that he had barely changed since the academy, at least physically. Small favors. Those favors soured when the years caught up with him. His deep blue uniform with silver sash made of 3 velvet lines had been soaked in blood more often than he cared to remember. The navy-colored rank tab on his shoulders and sleeves had 2 silver falconlings with 2 mini suns in between them, the wings of command and the suns he defended, or so said the ethos. In practice, it reminded him of how much blood he'd seen over the years. 3 shooting stars in front of a star-filled background lay over his heart, the shield of Interstar, though it may well have been a shield in one case, with his rank, name, and pilot's wings above it. On his arm lay the only insignia he really drew pride in, a tricorn design of gold and black with a 3-bar pyramid of gold in the middle. The design also held the crude motto, "First called, final star, we hold the line." Jason's sigh was almost a growl as he held the back of his head. First called. He had a blasted Corvette duty. One hand went for the hilt of the combat knife in the middle of his back. He liked to keep it there so either hand could reach it at any given time, though right now all he wanted to do was bash it on the table. It was better than thinking about the idiocy of his orders or the 2 times he'd used his officer blades for more than training and ceremonies. He stared at his mug for a moment while the urge subsided, then downed the last of his tea before heading out. He dropped most of his thoughts as he passed through the door, like discarding a jacket he no longer needed, something he'd gotten too good at doing over the years. Jason marched down the corridors as if in a hurry. In truth, he was trying to walk off the anger that killing holograms and drinking joke tea hadn't cured. But all he managed was to make his step barely audible on the metal floor. It and the walls were a soft blue, though the walls were more a tint than a full color. It seemed the designers of Interstar bases, uniforms, and most ships had a love affair with the color. Didn't keep the place from feeling military, despite the oval shape of the corridors. Jason tried using these thoughts to distract himself from his anger. When that didn't work, he tried clenching and relaxing his fists in a vain attempt to drop his emotions like he had his thoughts. It didn't help that he clipped his shoulders on one of the many support beams while trying to dodge an equipment trolley. The crewman tried to apologize, but Jason kept marching while he tried not to dig his fingernails into his palm. He held the shoulder till it stopped throbbing during the lift ride to his quarters. He softly sighed when he thought about what he'd like to do if he were in the same room as his superiors. Wonder how many would hit the deck if I pulled my PMAG on him. He knew one wouldn't, but the others might almost be worth it to see the looks on their faces. Almost. At least a fantasy put the first dent in his frustration. The dent was all it felt like as he marched down the corridor to his quarters. The main room was furnished with simple, violet chairs and a short couch crammed around a glass table all looking out a window with a blue-green planet just below. Not Earth, but the glow felt enough like it to help it feel like home. A tiny table with a food dispenser in the corner was currently dark like some forbidden land no one dared enter, much like his work desk nearby. Doors on the opposite side led to the bed he'd really like to drop into, assuming his emotions would let him. Since they currently wouldn't, he would have to settle for the large space his position afforded him. The quarters would normally be his alone, but he shared his with company that was welcome and requested by all parties involved. Once they were assigned to the same fighter, getting permission to share a room had been the easy part. Satisfying Interstar's regulations had not been. One cohabitant, his comrade Sundale, sat just to the side of the door. He was biting an itch beneath his dark, sandy gold fur that held the same color throughout. The only break in the gold was a white underside that extended up his front to the top of his muzzle, just touching his cheeks. The fox-looking Holdren had all three tails sticking straight out in response to the itch. The rust-red tail tips, with matching bands below, would have made perfect warning beacons were they glowing. He sat on 4 legs and just a little taller than the largest of Great Danes. Despite knowing better, Jason couldn't help seeing the animal first. It made Sundale feel more pet than companion sometimes, which made yet another dent in his anger. The dent grew into a real mood change as the doors closed behind him. The anger faded into simple frustration as Sundale stopped his biting to see who had entered. He roughed, shook his head, and shifted to sit facing the newcomer. "Who won this time?" Sundale asked. His voice was not so much nasal as it held just a touch of a higher pitch, something apparently unique to him rather than the norm among Holdrens. Jason wished he could growl as he unbuckled his weapon belt. "I think the holograms did. That or Command. I'm not sure which." "Couldn't change their minds?" "Nope. Worse yet, as the orders came, unofficially of course, from a councilman. Not sure how Ricky found out, but I appreciate him telling me. At least I know it's beyond his control, too. Unfortunately, that still means we're stuck in Corvette duty." Sunday only flicked an ear and returned to his itch. Jason, meanwhile, nearly ripped his knife harness out of the buckles. He tossed it and the weapon belt onto the couch, again wishing for the chance to vent on someone real. He flinched when a sharp yip came from the couch. His weapons clattered to the floor as the dull orange shoulders, back, and neck of the other Holden rose above the top of the couch. Much like Sundale, the rest of his mother's fur was sandy gold with a white underside, although her white covered her entire face up to between her ears. Gray covered the tip of her muzzle and chin, though it just barely touched her whiskers and didn't touch the top of her muzzle at all. Then the gray changed into a thick pattern of darker gray flecks that covered her face and throat, which enhanced the glare she was casting at him. It was only then Jason noticed 3 red tail tips, void of the red bands only male has had, hanging off the side of the couch. "Sorry, Yarain," he said. "You all right?" "I'm fine," she said in an even tone that betrayed no emotion. Not robotic, just level and always soft, gentle and smooth in a way that left Jason looking for a British accent she didn't have. She also didn't expand at her answer, which, as Jason had learned, was a norm among Holdrens. Combined with her glare, it forced him to be sure he had all the info he needed. "You sure? That yip didn't sound fine." "I was sleeping. And now I feel worse." Yarain gave a set of short, repeated huffs that were the Holdren form of laughter, a sound Jason had yet to find degrees in. He knew panting was sometimes also laughing, but he still didn't know the difference between a chuckle and busting a gut. If only Holdren smiled. At least then he'd have something to work from. "Don't worry, Jason," she said. "I don't bite unless threatened." "But she can kill whole herds with one glare," Sundale said. They may not smile, but they can't keep it from slipping into their voices. Despite the lack of facial expressions, Jason could hear the matching emotion in both of them. Their joy put him at ease at last. He did some laughing of his own when Yarain curled her lips in what even he could tell was a teasing snarl. Sundale countered by giving an equally fake cower and a pathetic whimper that sounded more like a pained meow. Jason laughed as the Holdrens continued an energetic fake duel. Times like these made it hard to see them as anything more than foxes, which had almost been a problem. They themselves said they were wild animals first. Wild animals usually run on instinct, something that could be a problem for a mother and son fighting on the same battlefield. Regulations written in desperate times meant it could still be done, but many joked that a cadet had an easier time getting a private dinner with a marshal. Thankfully, they had managed to convince every superior they needed to. Over the years, they proved multiple times they were more than capable of maintaining composure even when shit hit the fan. Though right now, Jason failed to keep his as the snarls and whimpers got sadder by the second. Each one put another dent in his frustration and a chuckle in his gut. It was a good thing, too, since his wrist computer, or wristcom, beeped to announce the arrival of a new message. He expected some dry conversation with who knows who. Instead, he saw from the Personal Artificial Intelligence Combat Computer Assistant, Pika. He tapped the button to receive, and the computer program spoke in a non-robotic male voice. "Major, The updated mission profile has been received. Jason grumbled as Yarain dove at Sundale so they could trade more pathetic paw swipes and weak bites at each other. Why am I getting it? It defaulted to you because it's marked important, but Captain Yarain has not responded to its arrival. I suspect she has a Riscom off while she's off duty. Why didn't I think of that? I don't suppose you could just Deep Six the whole thing. I could, but it wouldn't help. You'd still have to deal with it later. Jason grumbled again. Darn thing sounded like a true AI, but it really wasn't. More like a very adaptive program. Trouble was, I had a knack for being right. He knew that now was the time to dig into messages he didn't want to read. At least he didn't want to kill anyone anymore. He dragged himself to his desk as the fake Holdren fight faded into affectionate rubbing. Send it to my computer, Pika. Might as well get this over with. Confirmed, Major. I'll be sure to put the range on standby. Are you sure that thing isn't a true AI? Either way, the joke helped add another dent as the computer blinked on. Just as Pika opened the mission profile for him, Sundal pushed his head under Jason's arm into his lap. There he stayed with a rolling trill Jason swore he'd learned because it sounded like a purr. It was a sound Sundal never made for anyone else. Ever. Can I help you? Jason asked as he would a pet. I just wanted to know what our mission is, Sundal said innocently. I thought you could read. Sundal half barked the first words, the closest thing Holdren's had to an accent. Okay. I just choose not to. Jason put one hand on his hip with a glare of his own. Sundal replied with a pet-me look along with his purr. Jason laughed again while pushing Sundal off his lap. Get out of here, you crazy fox. Sundal jumped back, got low on his forelegs, and yipped excitement with his tail swishing playfully behind him. Come now, Jason. You know I'm not really a fox. Jason turned his chair around and folded his arms. Close enough, as you yourself have said on more than one occasion. You still should know better. He roughed again, his tails still swishing as they only did when playing. Jason shook his head, trying very hard not to feel better. He'd already failed. The pointless argument had triggered a laugh he couldn't stop. Before he knew it, most of his rage was gone. Son, he said through his grin, sometimes I don't know what to do with you. Thanks. Sundal dropped its display, but not the joy in his voice. Think nothing of it. I hate seeing you in such a rotten mood. As do I, Yarain said. However, I would like to know our mission. You could read it yourself, you know, Jason said. As third seed, mission profiles go to you first. Pika just sent it to me because you don't have your Riscom on right now. I'd have to forward it to you anyway. No reason to avoid the hunt you know is coming. Jason huffed at her perspective as he returned to his computer. Despite what he'd said, as group leader, it wasn't uncommon for Jason to be the one to read over mission profiles first, even though most of the briefing prep was still Yarain's responsibility. Add in the sharing of quarters, and it was a 50-50 split as to who got to tell whom about the next mission. A few more taps found his rotten mood returning with a slump of his shoulders. His summary came out almost robotic to match his contempt. 5 transports. General cargo, ground vehicles, building supplies, equipment, and materials to build a starport, a smattering of specialists to help them build it, all being escorted through quite possibly the safest portions of United Systems territory. A sleeper escort, Sundal growled. Jason wished he could do the same. What a waste. The Gold Group, considered by many to be the best in the fleet, comes off the line to nap their way between inner systems? Jance must be getting a kick out of this. Are there any interesting people on the transport? Yarain asked. Jason skimmed the mission profile in the hopes of finding something, anything, to salvage the mission. He didn't get far before he rubbed his eyebrows as if he might wipe his frustration away. We're not that lucky, although Command does want us to stop by Klistro 7 to test the new sensor pods they're installing, see if they pick up anything new. I can barely contain myself. Jason nodded silent agreement. It was something, but no one liked sleeper escorts. With little else to do for the night, the pilot rose to find something to wind down with. He couldn't take a step in any direction as each option was rejected. Reading? Too angry. Sleep? Wouldn't happen. Old TV shows? Wrong mood. Not even the antics of some 20th century sci-fi characters would be enough. He had too much on his mind. That, and deep down he still wanted to kill someone real, especially if they were a suit. His mind soon settled on an old cure for a busy mind he'd learned from a fellow pilot years back. When all else fails, he used to say, wear yourself out while focusing on any single task, especially if it is monotonous, tiring, or simple. Jason knew of only one such task, and it met all three criteria. He thanked the advice of his late father for making it available. He went to the couch to retrieve his knife, which he tossed onto his back with all the frustration still steaming inside. Sundale's ears perked, curious. "Where are you going?" Jason slammed his PMag into his holster with equal frustration. "Down to the hangar. Between my fight with Command and the strange movements from the Jansons, I need to find some mental unity if I expect to sleep. Best way I can think of to do that is to help install the new sensor pods." Sundale rose to his paws, stretching as he did. "I'll join you." "Thanks, son, but I can handle this alone." "I want to look at the turrets." Jason's hand went to his hip again. "Oh? May I ask why?" "Remember, I need details." Sundale roughed annoyance, but that's as far as it went. "We're overdue for a maintenance check. There's nothing more than that. Second Seas are always so fussy about their ships. You call 2 weeks overdue? Never mind. I won't turn down company. Come on. You joining us, Yarain?" A backward tick in her ears replaced what would be a shake of the head for a human. Sundale knew it without effort. Jason almost missed it. "No," she said, almost roughing the word instead of saying it. After a second, she added, "Thank you, Jason." Jason shrugged a silent, "Okay," then headed out. He stopped as the doors opened when he saw Sundale approach the desk. Before Jason could ask what he was up to, he got a reminder of how unique Holdrens were. Sundale's body gave a shimmer as he pushed off on his forelegs to stand upright. As he did, his hind legs grew larger, and his front legs became hands that remained largely paw-like, including pads and claws. His head tilted down to face forward as he took a step back to maintain his balance. His muzzles now stood just above Jason's not-quite-6-foot forehead. Sundale's tails gave a single, adjusting wave as he completed his shift into his finesse form, as the Holdrens called it. Like Yarain forcing the polite response a moment ago, Jason had gotten used to the differences, mostly because there really wasn't much of a difference between this and their four-legged primal form. The most striking was only because now that Sundale was on 2 legs, the small pouch that covered his genitals was more apparent. Being near the change, however, sent a chill down Jason's spine that he had to shake his head and shoulders to silence. He shook his head again as Sundale went for his custom uniform on the desk. Right, of course. While the core design was the same, Sundale had to slip his tails through inch-long socks in the back as he stepped into it. It was also a one-piece suit that zipped up the front from the sash, and the sleeves and pants stopped at their first joint. It was a compromise that Command had surprisingly agreed to. Since even the most form-fitting of clothing was shown to reduce a Holdren's speed and agility to a small degree, they were allowed to go bare paw unless there was a risk of something that could damage their paws. A pretty small margin, really, but both Holdrens had shown its value more than enough times to earn that right. That said, decompression and other hazards meant they couldn't always go without. Gloves and full-length pants with shoes were still there, and they were tucked up against the end of the sleeves and pant legs so tightly you could barely notice them. In much the same way, the tails had full-length socks of their own tucked at the base of each tail, and a hood sat on the back of the neck just like Jason's. While Sundale worked into his uniform, Jason couldn't help but chuckle, born of memories. 11 years, Jason said. You'd think I'd get used to that. Better than the first time, Sundale said. Jason threw up his hands in mock defensiveness. Hey, I didn't shoot. I only drew. You can't blame a young soldier for being careful. Sundale roughed amusement while slipping his arms through and zipping it up the front. I didn't. Good thing you didn't shoot, either. If you hadn't relaxed as fast as you did, I might have. Not that it would have mattered. You missed the first time. I can't imagine the second being much better. Sundale gave a playful growl to match his look while he slipped his wrist comm onto his right arm. Jason double-checked to be sure he had his own before they left for the nearest lift. They took it to near the hangars of the starbase, where an empty hallway suggested the hangars would be dormant. Jason knew better. They marched through the heavy doors into exactly what he expected. First came the strong stench of welded metal and fused wiring, a nice fit for the industrial yet polished walls, as well as the floodlighting that sometimes didn't feel as bright as it really was. Then came the chatter. A little on the quiet side, but no less busy as techs worked all over the various craft on the hangar floor, most of them G-21 Scorn heavy fighters. A patrol must have just come in or left, since the bay doors at the end of the hangar were closing. All in all, a normal day during an upgrade. Sendo went towards the storage cabinets on the back wall, while Jason walked through the fighters looking for his ship. He offered salutes as needed to engineers on the way, wondering how much they knew about his orders and how he'd reacted to them. He got so lost in his thoughts he almost killed his eye on the wing of his fighter. She was a fair little ship that Jason had grown fond of. The cockpit started at a rounded nose that stuck out in the middle of the central block and created a rounded bevel as it ran the length of the fighter. The ship's main weapons and systems occupied the rest of the block between the twin engine nacelles. Each nacelle had a cone recessed a few centimeters into the front that held most of her sensors. A twin Gatling plasmoid turret sat on top of each nacelle just behind the cones on each side. Her wings weren't wide, but still large enough to add to her profile and thick enough to hold spare components for in-field repairs, as well as the ship's main heat sinks. On rare occasions, they could hold some small cargo, too. Her hull was a dark red, except for the Interstar and wing insignias painted on her sides. While waiting for Sundale, Jason found himself running his hand along over the X1 painted beside the group logo. A lot of history there for him, much of it bloody. To think the fools at headquarters were casting it off like it never happened. They were putting the whole of the Alliance in jeopardy. If only he could do something besides yell. "Saying hello again, Jason?" Sundale said, carrying a tool belt for each of them. "That," Jason said, "and more. None of it important right now. I can't change the future as much as I'd like to. Don't try. When the danger comes, we'll face it, lick our wounds, have a few cubs, then return again the next day. Only thing you need to worry about right now is yourself and the state of your pack. Your pack is fine. Trust yourself enough to believe that you are as well. I know I do. No cowering behind the seats, eh, son? I guess you're right. At least I'll be out there in a position to make a difference." Sundale gave a very real, though short, growl. His ears didn't perk, which Jason knew meant the growl was only minor annoyance, or to get his attention. "We'll be out there," Sundale said, roughing the first word. "Don't forget us, Jason. You need us as much as we need you." Jason nodded understanding while accepting a tool belt. "Point taken. Thanks." Sundale gave a trio of quiet, trilling barks. Among Holdrens it could mean any number of things. Sundale had adopted this exact call as an expression of the bond between them. Jason regretted not being able to return anything beyond a smile and a nod. The one time he tried to repeat the call, he sounded more like a sick hound dog. After that, Sundale had made it clear the smile was enough. Jason strapped on the tool belt just as a tan-colored, hairless head with broad, engine-soiled shoulders appeared above them. His blue and silver jumpsuit wasn't much cleaner, yet it somehow didn't touch the rank on his arms. It was marked by 3 thin chevron lines above 3 bars with a hollow diamond in between. Like Jason, at the bottom of his rank tab sat a tiny winged ship with a sun on each side of its nose, the insignia of the Precision Strike Command, or PSC, their branch of Interstar. "Excuse me, sirs," First Sergeant Tillman said, "but are you all going to talk all night, or do you plan on actually doing something?" His tone said teasing, but Jason was still reminded why he was there. He put his other thoughts as far back as they would go while climbing a ladder to the top of the fighter. Tillman and a tech were kneeling beside the rear half of the starboard engine nacelle with tools in hand. Jason looked back to offer Sundale a hand, only to find him heading after an equipment trolley. "Glad you decided to join us," Sergeant Tillman said with a grin. "Sorry," Jason said, trying to sound lighter than he felt. "I've got a lot on my mind lately. You and every other pilot in this base, sir. It's like every one of 'em is expecting trouble. You ask me, the lot of you need a vacation. Sir." Jason waved him down before he had a chance to worry. "Relax, Sergeant. I agree. I just don't see it happening any time soon. Anyway, I'm not here to debate the mental state of the group. I'm here to work on those sensor pods. The tech beside Tillman froze while the engineer himself tried not to look insulted. "May I ask why, sir? I didn't think my abilities were in question. Unless this is an inspection, in which case, I must admit, sir, I ain't no mood for." Jason might have slapped him down for such a comment, except that during his posting up to the bays, they'd gotten acquainted well enough to know where the line was with each other. Sergeant Tillman just walked closer to that line than Jason did. As such, he let the comment pass with only a slight edge creeping into his voice. "I never said I doubt your skills, Sergeant. Nor is this an inspection." First Sergeant Tillman's eyes darted back and forth for a second. "Then, if I may ask, sir, what is this?" "A sleeping pill," Sundell said. He'd just returned with a diagnostic pack slung over his shoulder. Both engineers looked around to stare at Sundell while Jason stifled a laugh. "He's not far off," Jason said. "As I said, I have a lot on my mind. Can't sleep through it, so I came down here to get my thoughts centralized on something besides how many different ways there are to kill my superiors." Sergeant Tillman laughed while his young assistant shook his head in disbelief. The latter probably thought he was crazy. Jason decided to let him. After all, he wasn't all that wrong, and not just because Jason had chosen to be one of those rare pilots who actually knew how to fix his own ship. While technically in-mission repairs will fall to Sundell as the Active Engagement Systems Officer, or ASO, Jason's father had told him there was a lot more value to the skills than just redundancy. The more you know about your ship, the more you know what you can get out of it. There were no regs that he couldn't learn, and it gave him an additional way to get his mind off things. Plus, he liked the idea of not being dependent on one individual to put his ship back together should they get shot down. Most didn't mind him helping out either, so long as he didn't get in the way, something he made an effort to avoid as much as possible. Sergeant Tillman motioned Jason closer, still shaking off the laugh. Jason knelt beside him while Sundell went to perform his promised check on the turrets. Jason shook his head at him. "Darn Fox is stubborn when he wants to be." "So be it. At least the turrets would be in perfect condition." The tech opened the maintenance panel for the starboard nacelle. The armored hull lifted up first, then another layer of components and armored plating opened to reveal the starboard power core. 4 long sea-blue crystals ran a fourth the length of the nacelle just ahead of the aft engine assembly. They were connected to each other around a central hub that regulated and distributed the power stored in the crystals. It also served as a surge protector and, if need be, launching platform should the core need to be ejected. They were glowing just enough to cast a ghost light on the first of the foot-long Violon missiles stored in the starboard magazine. "You disarmed them warheads, didn't you, Marn?" Tillman asked his assistant. "Yes, sir," he said. "All systems are in standby mode." "Good. Pardon me, Major, but I assume you didn't get the instructions on these things yet?" "Use only," Jason said. "I hadn't gotten to the more technical stuff yet." "I don't blame you. It's dry stuff, it is. These new pods need more power than the old, so to start, we're going to need newer connections that can handle the drain." Jason nodded understanding with a look where they'd be working. "I was wondering why you were starting back here. Shouldn't be a problem." "Give me a second, though," Sundell said. "I want to do a quick power test. Hands off the core." All three raised their hands to make sure they weren't touching anything live. The soft hum rose from the core, held for a minute, then faded. Just as it did, Jason saw a spark so soft it was more a tick. "Did you see that?" "I'm not sure," Sergeant Tillman said. "Excuse me, Captain. Could you run your test again, please? Hold the power level for longer if you should." "Sure," Sundell yipped. Just like before, the core softly hummed and held for a minute. The spark struck again just before the hum faded. "Cut the power," Jason said. "We may have a problem here." The two workers disconnected all systems from the core, then Jason reached in to remove a black box from the end of one of the crystals. Sergeant Tillman watched as Jason turned it over his hands until he found scorch marks on the bottom. "That's odd," Jason said. "I've never seen a junction box do that before." "Me neither," Sergeant Tillman said. "With your permission, sir, let me take a look." Jason handed the box over while Sundell came over to dig at the core some more. Tillman used his tools to pry the box open to show the power relays and other circuitry inside. He pulled at the wire so he could see the bottom of the box. Jason watched with a mental alarm on the verge of sounding. "Sergeant, am I crazy, or is this thing missing some redundancy?" "You're not crazy, sir," Tillman said. "See this little tower here? There should be 3 of them. It's also not hard enough. Good thing we found this. One wrong nebula combat power likely would have fried it. Without the redundancies, there would be no recovering from it. You'd be down an entire crystal for a while, if not permanently. It gets worse, Sundell said. He lifted another such disassembled box to the others. A quick inspection showed it to be just as flawed as the other. Sergeant Tillman nearly growled himself. I don't like it. This is my hangar. No work should be done at all without prior notification. Least of all work this shoddy. Someone's going to lose their heads over this, they will. Perhaps literally, Jason said. He wasn't quite serious, since beheading wasn't on anyone's punishment list anymore. Though, when one considered what would happen, politically or career-wise, the effect might as well be the same. His mind soon touched on a more terrifying prospect. If his fighter had this issue, what else had been hidden? And that was just his own ship. When you consider the rest of the group, and possibly every other ship on the base, his shoulders sank as he bid a fond farewell to any chance at a good night's sleep. Sergeant, you better call in some help. We've got a lot of work to do. I was thinking the same thing, Tillman said. I just wanted to enjoy the lie of not having to for a moment. I hear that. Son, contact base security. Have them restrict outgoing communications till we sort things out. As Sundell and Sergeant Tillman climbed off the fighter to carry out their orders, Jason stared at the place where the junction boxes had been. The whole thing left him with an empty feeling born of the last time little things started adding up. Then it was an officer brainwashed by a Jantan process that thankfully proved amazingly hard to maintain, even harder to find a receptive subject, and whose architect had not survived his last attempt. This time, who knew what it was? Perhaps they'd recreated the procedure despite losing the man and the tech that made it work. Or it could be as simple as the commander who had somehow slipped past security. Of course, there was one possibility his mind wouldn't accept. A human working of his own free will. What could his motives be? Could somebody at HQ hate him that much? He shuddered at the thought and prayed this was less than it seemed, all the while feeling certain his prayers would go unanswered. And that concludes my reading of Chapter 1 from Fog of War. The rest of it, I'm afraid you'll have to get the book to read yourself. It's available just about really anywhere that books are available. Barnes & Noble, Amazon. I have ebook, paperback, and hardcover all available. Only copies bought through my store will be able to be signed and or personalized at no extra charge. And I still have some patches left, so if you want a limited edition unit patch, you might want to get now before I run out. At this time, however, I'm going to go ahead and open up the comments section. Ask me any questions you want to, and I will try my best to get to all of them. I can't promise I'll get to all of them, but I will certainly do my best to answer any and all questions you guys have. I thank you very much for listening to this, and I hope you will purchase the rest of the book. Until then, take care, be safe.